Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter, which is me. Let me welcome all of new listeners, people who've subscribed, everybody who's tuning in. Hopefully a lot of you will find this, as I said, inspiring, and hopefully a lot of you will join us again in the near future. So to put a little context to the podcast for all those new viewers, essentially what I do is I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist, but I'm also interested in gender issues, and particularly the situation of where masculinity is in the 21st century. As a psychologist and as a therapist, my practice is predominantly male. About 98% of my clients are male, ranging from the age of 13 to the oldest person I've worked with recently was 83, which was very interesting, and I learned a lot similarly in that situation. And I wasn't just, imparting ways of coping and so on. It was very much a mutual exchange in some ways, although my primary purpose was to help this person through a difficult situation. So part of that work is having launched a movement called Making Good Men Great. And unlike the men's movement, I'm not looking, and I'm trying to help men not to look to blame women, which is a major flaw in the current thinking. And, even people who, propose that they're not doing that in some way or another are actually falling foul of that distinction. It's also a bit of a misnomer in a sense, because it's us as men who created the culture with all the rights and privileges that go with that. Women had to fight for even a position that resembles some sort of equity and equality. So it wasn't easy for them. But the argument that I have is that the reason why we've got this problem in our culture is that fundamentally we are subject, and we have socialized according to an ideology that's known as patriarchy. Now, the problem with patriarchy fundamentally is that it's existed for millennia. And I argue in my book, Making Good Men Great, Surfing a New Masculinity, that it coincides with the event of food production, the agricultural revolution, if you want to call it that. And Diamond, a particularly wise scholar, fundamentally has dubbed this as humanity's worst mistake in some respects, okay? However, I'm not necessarily completely persuaded by that argument. I think that, if we start getting into either-ors, like, we should have stayed hunter-gatherers because that would have been better for us in many different ways, we're going to run into some serious conceptual and practical problems. My view fundamentally is that we can have a masculinity that is not based on patriarchy. And my proposition is that, firstly, as men, we need to understand the nature of patriarchy as an ideology, and that, we're really not looking at this problem that we're seeing in our culture today with the right lenses. We have a binary approach to this whole problem, which is politically based, where you have a leftist view or you have a right wing view, and my view is that that's sort of a bit myopic. But again, one of the issues here is that patriarchy tends to encourage binary thinking. It narrows our capacity to explore concepts from a much more inclusive point of view, which is one of the fundamental values that I propose in how we can evolve as men. That is, we become more inclusive rather than territorial. So I get a fair amount of flack about calling patriarchy an ideology, and let me explain why, in my view, this the concept of patriarchy is in fact an ideology. And it's because we have linked the idea of men's superiority with it being innate, it's natural. And there's a huge number of thinkers that go along, and the one that is probably in the most, at the forefront in the limelight, really, as it were, is Jordan Peterson. Now, again, I have some sympathies and some respect for the man on many different levels, but I don't believe that he's necessarily the sort of stringent conceptual thinker that, one, he portrays himself as, and B, that his followers, and I use that word quite intentionally and deliberately, portray him as. When you start examining, for example, his references to certain studies and so on, quite often he misquotes, quotes out of context, or completely decontextualizes what the researchers were actually saying. And there's a whole number of examples, and I won't go into those, but there's also, a number of more theological and religious thinkers who also fundamentally need to understand that what they're proposing and what they're promoting is a patriarchal culture. And they might dress it up in all sorts of, different clothes, but fundamentally the bottom line is that they want to perpetuate the culture of the 1950s and the sort of, idea of which it is based in, and that promote the idea of, morality as being connected to religion, which I have a major problem with, because religion does not necessarily promote morality. Morality exists in a secular context. And I know I'm going to get trolled for that as well, and that's okay. I'm happy for people to put up a reasonable, functional argument. I'm not happy to be, abused or threatened or anything like that. So, that's uncool. But it's, again, it's patriarchal quality is that if we don't get our way, we become combative. It's a bit like the Pope during the reign of Elizabeth I didn't like the fact that she was a Protestant queen, and he kept egging King Philip on to go to war, invade England, depose the Queen, and kill her. It's a very Christian position to take, I guess, especially when you're an expansionist and a mono ideologue. So the problem that we've got fundamentally is patriarchy's been around for so long that people think that what it's proposing is actually natural. It's in nature, like men are superior usually because they're stronger, because they're supposed to be less emotive or emotionally regulated, none of which is actually really true. And we can deconstruct the nature argument of patriarchy very easily and, in fact, quite quickly. There are some serious mythologies around this that serve only to perpetuate the status quo and to continue to disenfranchise people of difference. And I'm quite specific about that because patriarchy, in many respects, has really, in our Western culture, located itself with white males of privilege. If you don't have money, for example, you appear to be less valuable and less influential than those with money. It's a bizarre situation. So that's a little bit of the background, but to give you the pointy end of the stick is, why is it called Inspire Change? Because I believe that historically we are at a threshold, in fact, a crisis, and I'm not using the word crisis as something bad. I'm using the word more in the Eastern idea, in the the sort of ideal of within crisis is both the terror and the passion, or the capacity to have opportunities to change into the right direction. And I think that's really, really important. Now, if we're going to look at social change, first of all, I think we need to look at individual personal change. So for us as men, I need us, and I've gone through this work myself, both in therapy, but also in my own philosophical exploration and in the relationship I have with my wife, who's a feminist, and also works within the mental health field. And I had to recognise that there are many unspoken assumptions and beliefs that I held that were in fact patriarchal, and they affected how I felt, and they affected my behaviour, which undermined a sense of equity within my relationship. It wasn't that I was disrespectful, it was more of a sort of subconscious bias, an unconscious bias. And so a large part of this podcast always reflects back on the idea of where do I start as a man changing myself in the right direction? Because we're all going through change all the time. The question is, which direction are you going to take? And at the moment we're sitting in the eye of the storm, and at some point this is really going to come to a particular crescendo or climax, because as there is this emergent new consciousness, there is also an emerging powerful backlash. Now, we can find ourselves in serious difficulties with this, especially if we don't have the right values framework. Okay, which leads me into another part of what happened this week. It was quite an exciting week. I had the opportunity to MC a friend of mine's book launch. He's a photographer, brilliant artist and wordsmith, and he launched a book called Coast, Tree and Street. His name's Bruce Usher, and you can find him on bruceusher.com.au. And I encourage you, if you're into photography, if you're into black and white photography, the Australian landscape, both in terms of the ocean, the coast, trees, and the street, the urban landscape, do yourself a favour, check it out, and, get yourself a copy. It's certainly a worthwhile book to have on your coffee table. But the other thing that happened this week, which sort of came out of the blue yesterday when I was sitting at my computer doing some writing, was that I got an invitation through Clubhouse, which I haven't used Clubhouse at all. So forgive me if I'm not using the right language for those guys, for those of you out there who've used Clubhouse. It was a group in Mindful X, and they were talking about having attended a function called Wisdom 2.0. Now, I haven't had a chance to explore what that conference or stuff was about. I just know that there were a number of people attached to Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, but all of them and all the other people who were visiting in this space were interested in the concept about wisdom, but also about mindfulness. And so I sort of happily joined in with the initial intention of simply sitting there and being not an observer because it's all auditory, but just listening and seeing, people's different points of view and how they construct things and how they put this into place in their own life. And so I thought, well, one of the things I want to do is pick up with this too, because in my space, the word wisdom is essentially to some degree a philosophical position to have. But it's more than that. It's more than simply about thinking. Now, I have a framework that I operate with and teach, and that is that wisdom sits at the top of a hierarchy that firstly starts with just data. So let me use an IT metaphor. So basically the first platform is zeros and ones, okay? And when we arrange the zeros in particular ways, and those in IT and who are particularly into coding, forgive me if this is very basic and simple, but I'm not a coder, I'm not into IT specifically, but I am into the concepts. So the next level is we organise the data into information. And so information is essentially just stuff that's out there. Beliefs, attitudes, information like the media and so on. Now, obviously in the last 4 years, there's been a lot of manipulation about, information in the public space. I can rightly argue that social media and the internet hasn't made this thing any simpler, because in this space we get some really crazy ideas coming out. I don't believe how many people still subscribe to a flat earth, right, or questioning some of the things that we know scientifically. So from information we go to knowledge. Now that is where we start sifting through the information and organising it and structuring it and putting it together in a way that we can utilise effectively within the body of science, the body of philosophy, the body of inquiry. And knowledge is useful at a pragmatic level as well, but knowledge doesn't contain within it necessarily an ethical or a moral basis. Knowledge can be simply something that I literally cognitively know. Does it necessarily mean it resonates or aligns with what my experience is? No. And this is where we go to the next step, which is, what is wisdom? And so, like most of us in this century, one of the sort of steps that, one of the sort of reactions I'm going to see out there is that people immediately going to jump on Google wisdom, and up comes Wikipedia. And Wikipedia basically says that wisdom, sapience or sagacity, is the ability to think and act using knowledge, experience, understanding, common sense and insight. Okay, so quite a lot more complex than simply knowledge, right? Really, really important. Now, I'm going to throw something else in there, and that is that there is an intuitive element and there is a ethical, moral directive in wisdom. And that is that wisdom is how I articulate fundamentally all that stuff towards a better place for myself and others. All right, so, I do not subscribe to moral relativism. That is to say that, every culture has its own moral set and we should all respect that and so on. Let me throw in a very simple example. If the culture believes that sacrificing little children and burying them under a post that is going to support the house, I'm not on board with that ethically or morally. To me, that is not acceptable. It's based on a belief that absolutely has no foundation in anything that's about the betterment of the individual or the community. It is simply a belief that is actually quite disturbing, and we have many, many of these beliefs still active in our society. So no, I'm not going to be able to sort of necessarily stand back and allow that to happen, right? But we still act on a lot of these sorts of beliefs as if they were true, to the detriment of others. We're really struggling at this point in time in our culture to have religious beliefs that do not infringe, encroach, and attempt to dominate others. And I reckon we need to sort that one out quick smart, otherwise we're going to find ourselves in another 7th century AD or CE, depending on which definition you want to use. I would have thought in the 21st century we would have progressed further to be more inclusive, to be more respectful and democratic, egalitarian, and to be more distributive, and to be more collaborative. I watched a YouTube video this morning, in fact, and it was an interesting thing. It was a thing about this guy going around in Israel and asking these questions of Palestinians. One of the questions he asked was, if you're a Muslim, would you marry a Christian? And it was really interesting because a lot of the guys had no problem with it. And I'm sort of sitting there going, oh, that's really interesting, that there is a depth in that I hadn't necessarily anticipated. And my bad, okay? However, when he started asking women about this issue, one of the things that became very clear was that for women to marry outside of Islam, it was forbidden. And that's where I went, okay. What we got again here is a demonstration of an entrenched patriarchal attitude. It's okay for men to do, but it's not okay for women. And so, again, this is not just confined to Christianity, Islam. It includes many, many, many different religious beliefs that have these constructs, these beliefs that are not based on anything other than a religious framework. And if we are going to evolve, we need to examine what it is that we believe a lot more closely. And I'm not saying you should give up your religious belief. I'm saying, how do you reconcile the issues between a patriarchal framework that underpins most monotheistic religions in particular, and the humanitarian or humanistic principles of equality, of inclusion, of tolerance, of compassion that we so desperately are going to need to resolve the cultural, political, and material issues that we're confronting with, including ecological issues. Right? We have lived on this planet, in a sense, exploiting it, and we've recognized, at least a lot of us have recognized, that that is like a bullet train heading towards a brick wall. At some point, the impact is going to be disastrous, and we're seeing it here and now. So, for me, have a think about this. I offer this as a gift of thought, coming from a place of wisdom and compassion and tolerance. And that is one of the things I'd like to inspire in us as men. If we are going to transcend the confines of a zombie ideology like patriarchy, it is time to shed that cloak and move beyond it. Because it's not just about women. As I've said before, patriarchy is more responsible for male deaths than anything else. And do we want to perpetuate that? You know. And if we need to think about what, is this healthy for my son as much as it is healthy for my daughter, for my wife? And on that note, I'll sign off and I'll be checking in with you again in a week's time. Until then, goodbye and embrace change.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.